Welcome to Raising Awe Seekers, where we explore how the science of wonder can help us thrive. I'm your host, Deborah Farmer Kris, and today we're talking about hope. So this morning while walking the dog in the snow, the phrase Audacity of Hope just popped into my brain. But I couldn't remember where the phrase had come from. So when I came in from the cold, I hopped online and did some searching. And so it was the name of a book by Barack Obama. But it turns out there's more to the story. In 1886, British artist George Frederick Watts created a painting called Hope. Now, he was part of the symbolist movement, and he described the concept in a letter to a friend in 1885. He wrote, "Hope sitting on a globe with bandaged eyes playing on a lyre which has all the strings broken, but one out, of which poor little tinkle, she is trying to get all the music possible, listening with all of her might to that little sound. Do you like the idea?" His painting was briefly popular. It hung in a British museum, and a print adorned the home of Teddy Roosevelt. And then, not so much. But in 1959, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. based a sermon on the painting. And then later in the 1980s, Reverend Dr. Frederick G. Sampson delivered a lecture about it at the University of Virginia. A pastor named Jeremiah Wright was in the audience, and in the 1990s, he delivered a sermon describing the painting like this. "With her clothes in rags, her body scarred and bruised and bleeding, her harp all but destroyed, with only one string left, she had the audacity to make music and praise God. To take that one string you have left and to have the audacity of hope." A law student named Barack Obama sat in the pews that day, and a decade later, Obama changed to of, and the Audacity of Hope became the name of his 2004 convention keynote address and the theme of his presidential campaign and later a book. And this morning, 139 years after Hope was painted and joined the ranks of human creation, it found its way into my little brain through a circuitous route of art, religion, and political history. And all of this got me thinking about an interview I did with Dr. Jamil Zaki. He's the author of Hope for Cynics, The Surprising Science of Human Goodness. Now, last September, I had a chance to interview him. And sometimes conversations just stick with you. Well, this one has been on my mind a lot during January 2025, a month that will probably be put in a time capsule to be looked at later more carefully when we can think more clearly about it. So anyway, I went back and I reread my own article. You can find it on KQED's Mindshift under the headline Raising Hopeful Kids in Cynical Times. And I really did need to hear his insights again, so I'm going to share it with you here because it's really practical for us and for our kids. In the face of uncertainty, parents often seek to protect children by warning them about the world's threats and dangers. But is this the right approach? Dr. Jamil Zaki is the director of Stanford's Social Neuroscience Lab and author of the new book, Hope for Cynics, The Surprising Science of Human Goodness. In an interview, Zaki told me that when adults, quote, try to keep our kids safe by making them feel unsafe, they fuel a cynicism that can have unintended consequences for children's mental and emotional well-being. He said, "If we focus kids on the negative, on the worst parts of life and the worst parts of humanity, we're going to end up shrinking their world, making it harder for them to trust and making it harder for them to explore, take risks, and form relationships." Unquote. Now, that doesn't mean adults should abandon safety protocols. Zaki is the father of 2 young daughters, and when they complain about putting on sunscreen or buckling their seatbelt, he asks them, "What's my most important job?" And they respond, "To keep us safe." That's just like a fundamental parent responsibility. But the more nuanced question is this, Zaki said. What are we depriving our children in the name of safety? Emphasizing a hopeful mindset over a cynical one, Zaki argues, is an empirically wiser parenting choice. Let's first define some terms. Zaki describes optimism as a belief that the world will be better, and cynicism as a belief that it will never be better. But hope, he says, is the conviction that the world can be better. Under this framework, hope is empowering because it requires action and allows for agency. The future can be better because humans can do something to make it so. Zaki put it this way: optimism is us telling our kids, "Don't worry, honey, it's going to be fine." First, we can't guarantee that because we don't know what the future holds. Second, it leaves our kids on the sidelines, observing helplessly as they see things that might be difficult or harmful. In contrast, hope is telling our kids, "I don't know what is going to happen, but I know you can make a difference." According to surveys cited by Zaki, the majority of parents believe that teaching kids that, quote, "the world is dangerous and competitive," unquote, will help them be more successful. But this worldview can actually be detrimental to children's academic success. Zaki points to a research study of over 200,000 people in 30 countries. Cynics scored less well on tasks that measure cognitive ability, problem solving, and mathematical skill. Despite this, he writes, the stereotype of the happy, gullible simpleton and the wise, bitter misanthrope lives on, stubborn enough the scientists have named it the, quote, cynical genius illusion. So why would cynicism dampen cognitive acumen? Perhaps part of the answer can be found in curiosity. Curiosity primes children's brains for learning. Curious kids want to know why, and that pushes them past simplistic or absolutist notions about the world. Children have an impulse to explore and make sense of the world. But that also means that they can absorb the fears of adults closest to them. Kids are sponges, said Zaki, and often we're saturating those sponges with the dirty water of our own biases, but we don't have to. We can allow their curiosity to direct them to a more accurate and hopeful set of information instead. That means adults have work to do, Zaki said. Building hope often means unlearning a lot of bad intel that we've received from culture, media, and, quote, the shredder of social media, unquote. Scary stories can feed our worst perceptions about what people are like and can cause us to overestimate dangers. Zaki said, hope isn't a matter of tuning out and burying our heads in the sand. Hope is a matter of paying closer attention and focusing more intently on what the world has to offer. Hope is a response to data. Take, for example, stranger danger. According to a 2023 Pew Research survey, 28% of American parents say they are extremely worried that their children will be abducted, with another 31% saying they're somewhat worried about it. And yet the actual risk of a child being kidnapped by a stranger is incredibly low. According to researchers out of the University of California, Irvine, the actual risk of a teen or child being abducted by a stranger and killed or not returned is about 1 in 1.4 million annually, a risk so small that it's effectively zero. They continue. The idea that unsupervised children are in constant danger is relatively new. Just one generation ago, children had much more freedom to explore the surroundings. In the early 1970s, psychologist Roger Hart spent 2 years making maps of the places that children in a rural New England town were allowed to go by themselves. He found that 4- and 5-year-olds were allowed to travel throughout their neighborhoods alone, and 10-year-olds had free run of the town. 40 years later, Hart returned to the same town and found that although the crime rate was exactly the same, most children were now forbidden from roaming past their own backyards. Zaki explains that data clearly shows that people who think the world is dangerous do worse in terms of their mental health, careers, and happiness. But because we've passed our fears on to kids, they are less trusting than we were, and they have less freedom than we did. So Zaki recommends modeling fact-checking our own cynical beliefs. Quote, when I find myself mistrusting somebody I've just met for the first time, I say, wait a minute, Zaki, what data do you have to back up that mistrust? And oftentimes the answer is nothing. I have no data here. It's just my instincts, and our instincts skew negative compared to the real evidence. So I try to question my cynical instincts, and I try to encourage my kids to question their cynicism as well, to be curious and skeptical instead of cynical. Unquote. Researchers have found that humans generally tend to underestimate human goodness. This is another area where data can be both helpful and hopeful. Take this study as an example. A group of researchers dropped nearly 17,000 wallets in 40 countries over the course of 2 years. Some wallets had no money. Some had about $13 and some had the equivalent of $100. All the wallets contained contact information of the owner. So how many people attempted to reach the owner of the lost wallet? Researchers assumed that the higher the amount in the wallet, the fewer would be returned. A poll of 279 top-performing academic economists agreed. But the exact opposite turned out to be true. 46% of empty wallets were reported, as compared to 61% of $13 wallets and 72% of the $100 wallets. The more money lost, the more people went out of their way to return the money. People wanted to help out a stranger they had never met. Zaki wasn't surprised by this because his research has found that most people value compassion over selfishness. This is important information. If our kids believe that the majority of people simply don't care about pressing issues, it's easy to feel hopeless. After years of working with college students, Zaki believes that much of young people's anxiety stems from the perception that the world is struggling and that I can't do anything about it. Because of the internet, today's adolescents are global citizens in a way that previous generations were not. Feelings of helplessness accentuate distress. Richard Weisbord, director of Harvard's Making Caring Common project, notes that kids and adults are likewise more distressed when they feel helpless and passive and more comfortable when taking action. Adults can help children turn empathy into action by teaching them ways to, quote, expand their circle of concern, reach out to others, and make a difference in the community, unquote. One practical strategy of fostering hope is savoring, or simply noticing the good stuff that happens. Noticing small moments of human goodness helps us correct the negativity bias that most of us are prone to. As Zaki explains, our minds are structured to pay lots of attention to threats. And that's good because it keeps us safe, but it's also a bias that makes us wrong about what the world is like and what people are like. So savoring beautiful things and positive experiences is a great exercise in terms of balancing our perspective. When Zaki thinks of hopeful parenting, one phrase that comes to mind is underbearing attentiveness. Becoming a hopeful parent in a cynical world is not easy, Zaki told me. Perhaps the starting point is to expand our ideals as parents. Quote, keeping my kids safe is super important, but having them become engaged citizens of the world who embrace opportunities to connect with people, that's equally important, he said. So I'm just going to leave those thoughts here. Yes, it's still January, and it has been such a January. And I truly believe that hope is a brave, gritty virtue. There's really nothing naive about it. Till next time, I'm Deborah Farmer Kris, and this is Raising Awe Seekers.